The rise of the Crusades and the context of the Second Crusade. The Crusades were historical phenomena that shaped the relationship between the West and the East during the Middle Ages. The crusading movement officially began in 1095, when Pope Urban II called for the First Crusade at the Council of Clermont, motivated by the desire to recapture Jerusalem from Muslim hands. With the initial success of the First Crusade in 1099, the Crusaders managed to establish a series of Christian states in the Levant, including the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the County of Edessa, the Principality of Antioch, and the County of Tripoli. These Crusader states were designed to function as bastions of Christianity in the East, but they were far from politically stable entities. They depended on the constant flow of men and resources from Europe and faced continued resistance from local Muslim forces, who never fully accepted the Christian presence in the region. The County of Edessa, in particular, due to its remote and border location, was vulnerable to attack. In 1144, Emir Zengi, governor of Mosul and Aleppo, led a military campaign that culminated in the fall of Edessa, marking a major defeat for the Crusaders. The loss of Edessa was a watershed moment for Christians in Europe. Seen as a profound blow to the Christian presence in the East, the event generated a sense of urgency and religious outrage, leading to the call for the Second Crusade. In a context of growing tension between Christianity and Islam, the Second Crusade aimed to reclaim Edessa and reinforce the Crusader states at a critical moment in their existence. The call for the Second Crusade, the role of Saint Bernard of Clairvaux. The call for the Second Crusade was made by Pope Eugene III, who issued the papal bull Quantum Predecessors in 1145, calling on Christians to participate in a new military expedition to retake Edessa and other lost territories. However, it was Saint Bernard of Clairvaux who played the most important role in mobilizing for this crusade. Saint Bernard, an influential and passionate Cistercian abbot, traveled throughout Europe preaching the crusade with unparalleled zeal. Saint Bernard's sermons not only stressed the spiritual duty of Christians to protect holy sites, but also promised indulgences, the complete forgiveness of sins, to those who participated. He saw the crusade as an act of collective penance, a path to spiritual redemption in a world marked by corruption and sin. His fiery rhetoric, combined with his charisma, managed to attract the participation of two important European monarchs, Louis VII of France and Conrad III of Germany. The motivations behind the Second Crusade: more than religion. Although the crusade was presented primarily as a religious mission, the motivations of the participants were complex and varied. Spiritual motives played a central role, especially for the more devout peasants and knights, who saw the crusade as an opportunity to atone for their sins and obtain eternal salvation. However, there were also significant political and economic reasons that drove nobles and kings to engage in crusade. For many nobles, the crusade was an opportunity to acquire land and wealth in the East. European feudalism was a system based on land tenure, and conquering territories in the Levant offered an opportunity to expand power and influence. In addition, the crusade provided an opportunity for feudal lords to settle local disputes by sending unruly knights away, relieving social and political pressure in their lands. For kings, the crusade was a tool for diplomacy and internal strengthening. Louis VII, for example, saw the crusade as a way to reinforce his authority over the French nobles by uniting them in a common cause. Conrad III, the first German king to participate in a crusade, hoped to strengthen his political legitimacy and establish alliances on the European stage. Preparations for the Second Crusade, logistics and strategy. Preparations for the Second Crusade involved a great deal of logistical and diplomatic effort. Unlike the First Crusade, which was organized in a relatively improvised manner, the Second Crusade relied on the direct involvement of European monarchs, which meant an even greater need for organization. The armies of Louis VII and Conrad III set out separately, intending to rendezvous in Constantinople before continuing on to the Middle East. The crossing of the Byzantine Empire was complicated by political tensions. The Byzantines, who had already faced problems with undisciplined crusaders during the First Crusade, were reluctant to allow a large Christian army to pass through their territory. Byzantine Emperor Manuel I Komnenos, aware of the risks of allowing the passage of. With such large armies, the Crusaders adopted a cautious and controlled approach, providing limited supplies and military escorts for the Crusaders. However, the lack of coordination among the Crusader troops made the crossing even more problematic. Conrad III, who led the German army, suffered heavy losses during his march through Anatolia due to constant attacks by Seljuk Turks and shortages of supplies. Louis VII, who led the French army, also faced similar difficulties, compounded by internal conflicts and disputes among the nobles who accompanied him. The arrival in the Levant and the change of strategy from Edessa to Damascus. Originally, the primary objective of the Second Crusade was to retake Edessa, but conditions in the Levant forced the Crusaders to change their plans. By the time they reached the Holy Land, the Crusader leaders realized that Edessa was well defended by Muslim forces and would be extremely difficult to retake. This led the Crusaders to consider other strategic targets, eventually deciding to focus on the city of Damascus. The choice of Damascus as a target was both strategic and political. Damascus was a prosperous and well-fortified city, and its capture would have been a major blow to the Muslims and would have significantly strengthened the Crusader position in the east. However, the decision to attack Damascus was controversial among the Crusaders themselves, as the city had been an occasional ally of the Crusader states in previous conflicts against Zengi and his successors. The siege of Damascus, which took place in 1148, was marked by poor planning and disastrous execution. The Crusaders failed to coordinate their forces properly, and the defense of Damascus, led by Mu'in ad-Din Unr, was efficient and resilient. Lack of supplies and the difficulty of maintaining a prolonged siege further weakened the Crusader position. After only 4 days of fighting, the Crusaders were forced to retreat, suffering a humiliating defeat. The immediate aftermath of the Second Crusade: demoralization and internal tension. The failure of the Second Crusade had profound consequences for Western Christendom. The defeat at Damascus not only frustrated the military objectives of the Crusaders, but also had a devastating impact on the morale and confidence of the participants. Many Crusaders, including Louis VII and Conrad III, returned to Europe disillusioned and with their reputations damaged. The defeat also led to increased tensions between the Crusader states and their European allies. Local nobles in the Levant resented the Crusader leaders, accusing them of mismanagement and lack of commitment. On the other hand, the newly arrived Crusaders criticized the local barons for not providing sufficient support during the siege of Damascus. In addition, the failure to gain additional territory for Christendom led to a crisis of faith among many European Christians. St. Bernard's promises of victory and divine favor were questioned, and many came to view the crusade as a futile and ill-planned endeavor. St. Bernard himself, upon returning to Europe, faced criticism and had to justify the failure of the crusade as a result of the sins of the Crusaders, rather than a failure of strategy or leadership. Cultural and intellectual exchanges. The positive legacy of the Second Crusade. Despite its military failure, the Second Crusade had a significant impact on cultural exchange between East and West. Contact with Muslim culture brought a range of innovations and knowledge to Europe, especially in areas such as medicine, astronomy, mathematics, and philosophy. The returning Crusaders brought with them new concepts and techniques, which eventually contributed to the intellectual flowering of Europe. For example, Muslim medicine was more advanced than European medicine at the time, with organized hospitals and more sophisticated surgical techniques. The Crusaders learned about the use of medicinal herbs, hygiene practices, and wound care, knowledge that was incorporated into European health systems in the centuries that followed. In addition, interaction with Muslim philosophical thought, particularly the works of philosophers such as Averroes and Avicenna, helped reintroduce Aristotelian thought to Europe, influencing the development of medieval scholasticism. Geopolitical impact. Muslim reaction and the rise of Saladin. The failure of the Second Crusade also had a profound impact on the Muslim world. The defeat of the Crusaders strengthened the position of Muslim leaders and encouraged greater cohesion among the previously divided Islamic factions. This allowed for the emergence of more effective and unified leaders, most notably Saladin. Although Saladin was not directly involved in the Second Crusade, he benefited from the lessons learned during the period. He saw the importance of uniting Muslims in a common front against the Crusaders, and his diplomatic and military skills eventually led to the reconquest of Jerusalem in 1187 during the Third Crusade. Saladin's figure became synonymous with Muslim resistance and with a more focused and effective leadership in the fight against the Crusader presence in the Middle East. Social and cultural legacies. Changes in Europe and the East. The Second Crusade also had lasting social implications in Europe. The participation of women in the management of estates during the absence of the Crusader men led to greater female autonomy in some contexts. Women such as Eleanor of Aquitaine, who accompanied Louis VII on the Crusade, became important figures in the politics and diplomacy of the time. Furthermore, the failure of the Second Crusade led to a deeper reflection on the nature of the Crusades and on the interaction between Christianity and Islam. Many intellectuals and theologians began to question the efficacy and morality of the Crusades, opening the way for a broader debate on the relationship between the Christian West and the Muslim East. This not only influenced the politics and diplomacy of the time, but also shaped the cultural and religious perceptions of both sides. The Second Crusade in the context of medieval history. The Second Crusade was a highly complex event, marked by a series of strategic failures, diverse motivations, and lasting consequences. Although it was a military failure, it contributed to the development of a cultural exchange that left its mark on medieval Europe and on interactions between the West and the East. The Crusade also highlighted the limitations of Christian power in the Middle East, showing that religious fervor, although powerful, was not enough to guarantee military success. The Second Crusade represents an example of how history is shaped not only by victories and conquests, but also by failures and lessons learned. The lessons learned during this crusade influenced the course of subsequent crusades and left a lasting legacy in understanding the complexity of the relationship between Christianity and Islam. Although the crusade failed in its immediate objectives, its impact was felt in unexpected ways in both the culture and politics of the following centuries. Social dynamics and mass participation, a new form of popular mobilization. The Second Crusade highlighted a phenomenon that had already been observed in the First Crusade, the mass mobilization of diverse segments of European society. Unlike traditional military campaigns, the Crusades involved not only knights and nobles, but also peasants, merchants, artisans, and even women and children, each driven by different reasons. The participation of peasants and commoners was especially notable, as it revealed an unprecedented degree of religious fervor. For these social groups, the Crusade offered an escape from the precarious conditions of feudal life and a chance to improve their material lives. Historical accounts indicate that many of these participants had no formal military experience, but were driven by a strong sense of spiritual mission and a desire to achieve eternal salvation. The Church encouraged this popular participation with promises of total forgiveness of sins, making the Crusade a journey of collective penance. Although often seen as followers of the main army, these humble crusaders played essential roles in the logistics of the campaigns. They were responsible for transporting supplies, building temporary fortifications, and even growing food in conquered territories. This integration of different social strata in the Crusades broadened the understanding of what holy war was, making it a collective experience that transcended social class and reinforced the idea of a unified Christianity. The influence of religious orders, Knights Templar and Hospitallers. The Second Crusade also marked the rise of military religious orders such as the Knights Templar and Hospitaller, who played an increasingly important role in subsequent crusades. These orders were not simply groups of devout warriors. They represented a unique fusion of religious faith, military organization, and resource management. The Templars, for example, began to establish financial networks and logistical support structures that helped finance the crusade. They developed rudimentary banking systems, allowing the Crusaders to deposit funds in Europe and withdraw the money in the Middle East, an innovation that facilitated the long-range operations of the crusading campaigns. In addition to their military role, the Hospitallers, whose origins lay in caring for pilgrims and the sick, played a crucial role in providing medical support during the Crusades. They established hospitals along pilgrimage routes and near battlefields, providing treatment to combatants and non-combatants alike. This support structure helped to ensure the continuity of operations, especially in hostile environments where disease and injury were common. Trade and the expansion of Mediterranean trade routes. Although the Second Crusade failed militarily, it did provide a boost to trade between Europe and the Middle East. The trade routes that developed from the Crusades connected Italian port cities such as Venice, Genoa, and Pisa with markets in the Levant. This led to the growth of a thriving mercantile economy that facilitated the import of spices, silk, luxurious fabrics, and other Oriental goods. The presence of the Crusaders also encouraged the establishment of trading colonies in strategic cities such as Acre, Tyre, and Tripoli. These colonies became centers of economic and cultural exchange, where European merchants interacted with Muslim, Jewish, and Byzantine traders, fostering a flow of knowledge and commercial practices. Accounting techniques, new forms of contract, and the introduction of innovations such as the Bill of Exchange were adopted in Europe, contributing to the development of the European banking system. The expansion of trade routes also impacted Europe's agricultural economy, as the Crusaders brought back to the continent new farming techniques, such as the use of more advanced irrigation systems and knowledge of Eastern crops such as rice, sugar, and citrus fruits. This commercial integration helped revitalize the European economy, which experienced significant growth in the following centuries. Literary and artistic narratives inspired by the Crusades. The Crusades, including the Second Crusade, inspired a wealth of literary and artistic production in medieval Europe. Stories of the Crusades were portrayed in chronicles, epic poems, chansons de geste, and even illuminated manuscripts, which helped shape popular perceptions of military campaigns in the East. The figure of the Crusader, often idealized as a brave and devout knight, became a symbol of bravery and heroism in medieval literature. One of the most influential works of this period was the Song of Roland, which, although written during the period of the Crusades, portrayed the conflict between Christians and Muslims in an allegorical way, presenting the Crusader as an exemplary Christian hero. This work and others like it helped to create a collective image of sacred war, extolling faith and courage as supreme virtues. Artistic representations of the Crusades also helped to reinforce the legitimacy of the campaigns in the eyes of the European public. Churches and cathedrals were decorated with images of Crusader knights, glorifying their mission as an essential part of Christianity. Sculptures, stained glass windows, and tapestries were commissioned to commemorate the participation of nobles and kings in the Crusades, creating a visual narrative that influenced public opinion for centuries. Impact of the Crusades on Western philosophy and science. Interaction with the East during the Second Crusade and subsequent campaigns was also a catalyst for intellectual advancement in Europe. During the Crusades, Europeans came into direct contact with Muslim philosophical and scientific texts, many of which were translations of the works of Aristotle, Galen, and other Greek thinkers that had been preserved and commented on by Islamic scholars. This transfer of knowledge helped spark a revival of scholastic thought that culminated in Thomas Aquinas, one of the greatest medieval philosophers and theologians. The Crusades also contributed to the advancement of the exact sciences. Interactions between Muslim and Christian scholars in the fields of mathematics and astronomy resulted in the introduction of concepts such as the use of the number zero, algebra, and more precise astronomy based on detailed observations of the sky. These intellectual exchanges were crucial to the development of European science and the emergence of a more analytical and empirical mindset in the West. In addition to science and philosophy, the Crusades influenced the practice of European medicine. The Crusaders brought back more sophisticated methods of treatment, including the use of herbal anesthetics, suturing techniques, and even the concept of hospitals as centers of treatment and convalescence. This represented an evolution in medical practice that was further refined during the Renaissance. The long-term geopolitical consequences, a new international order. The geopolitical impact of the Second Crusade was also felt in the decades and centuries that followed. Although the Crusade failed in its immediate objectives, it marked a turning point in the relationship between the Christian West and the Muslim East, setting a precedent for future military and political interventions in the region. From this point on, Europeans realized that campaigns in the Middle East would not be easily won and that conquering territories would require more than mere religious fervor. The failure of the Second Crusade to establish a more secure Christian domain in the Levant led to the development of new political and diplomatic strategies. The Crusader states, now more aware of their vulnerability, began to seek temporary alliances with local Muslim leaders, using diplomacy as a complementary tool to warfare. This more pragmatic approach was an attempt to ensure the long-term survival of Christian possessions in the Middle East. In addition, the failure of the Second Crusade also served as a wake-up call to European leaders about the need for greater military organization and strategic planning. Subsequent crusades were more carefully planned, with greater emphasis on logistics, recruitment, and cooperation between the different European kingdoms. This evolution in strategic thinking marked a shift in European military campaigns, influencing subsequent wars not only in the Middle East, but also in internal conflicts in Europe. The Second Crusade as a catalyst for internal reform in the church and politics. The failure of the Second Crusade also had a significant impact within the Catholic Church itself and on the political structures of Europe. Disillusionment with the outcome of the Crusade led to a deeper questioning of the effectiveness of ecclesiastical leadership and the role of the Pope as a leader of the Crusades. The Church was forced to rethink its approach to the Crusades, developing a more rigorous set of rules for subsequent campaigns and seeking greater control over recruitment and financing of expeditions. In the political realm, the Second Crusade exposed the fragility of cooperation between the Christian kingdoms of Europe. Internal rivalries between nobles and monarchs during the campaign were a major factor contributing to the failure of the crusade. This recognition led to a gradual move towards centralization of power, as monarchs sought to consolidate their forces and reduce the influence of local feudal lords. In France, for example, Louis VII returned from the crusade with a renewed sense of urgency to reinforce his control over the nobles, while in Germany, the failure of Conrad III was a catalyst for changes in power and domestic politics. This drive for greater political cohesion and centralization of power contributed to the formation of nation-states in Europe, which would eventually play a more effective role in the later Crusades and in international politics in general. The cultural legacies of the Second Crusade in the Middle East. The cultural legacy of the Second Crusade was not limited to Europe. It also influenced Middle Eastern societies in a number of ways. Although the conflict was predominantly seen as an invasion, there was also an involuntary cultural exchange. Local Muslims, in contact with Europeans, absorbed some Western practices, especially in the areas of military organization and fortified architecture. Furthermore, interactions between Christians and Muslims resulted in some forms of cooperation, albeit temporary and strategic. For example, political alliances occasionally emerged between crusaders and Muslim emirs against common enemies. These alliances demonstrated the adaptability and political pragmatism of both sides, which often overcame religious lines in favor of more immediate and tangible goals. The European presence also influenced Muslim art and architecture, particularly in areas such as Syria and Palestine, where European decorative and structural elements were integrated into local buildings. This fusion of architectural and artistic styles is a testament to the complex cultural interaction that occurred during the Crusades, showing that even in times of war, societies can influence each other in profound and lasting ways. The Second Crusade as a mirror of the human condition. The Second Crusade, although widely considered a military failure, represents a valuable window into understanding the dynamics of the Crusades as a whole and into reflecting on the nature of human interactions in times of conflict. It reveals not only the complexity of the motivations behind the Crusades, ranging from religious faith to the pursuit of power and wealth, but also the capacity for adaptation, learning, and evolution of the societies involved. The legacy of the Second Crusade transcends battles and sieges. It is found in cultural exchanges, in internal reforms of the Church, in the evolution of religious practices, and in the development of religious traditions, in diplomatic and social transformations in both East and West. It serves as a reminder that history is shaped not just by victories and defeats, but by ongoing processes of interaction, learning, and adaptation that continue to influence the modern world in subtle but significant ways.